to our study. We're going to be continuing in the book of Ezra today. This is our third study. We will be going into chapter 9. If you remember from the beginning of this study, we didn't actually start on chapter 1 because we've been comparing both Nehemiah and Ezra. And part of the story Nehemiah takes, and part of the story Ezra takes. And so we are working on the Ezra part. This is, like I said, the third part. And we're going to be starting in chapter 9 of Ezra, verse 1. And if we remember our time period here, we're talking about when the house of Israel left Babylon. If we remember, Nebuchadnezzar came in, destroyed Jerusalem, took captive some of the house of Israel, and took them to Babylon, where they lived for several years. And now we have this period when Babylon begins to fall. The Medes and Persians come in. Zerubbabel returns to Israel. Haggai the prophet begins to prophesy. Ezra comes back, and Nehemiah comes back. And as we can see in our timeline right here, we're focusing right now in this part of our study on nothing more than the study of Ezra's return. And we're trying to look at this in a parallel view of when God took his people out of Babylon and current present day events. If we remember correctly, Revelations tells us about the time period that we're in. God calls his people out of Babylon, and that's what he's asking for us to do, to come like he did then, for us to come out of Babylon. That's very difficult because Babylon is comfortable. There's already markets in Babylon. There's already, established families in Babylon. And so for us to come out of Babylon is actually very difficult because it requires us to leave our comfort zone, and that's not easy to do. And so that's what we're looking at. And so let's go ahead and start in verse 1. Now when these things were done, the princes came to me, saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands, doing according to their abominations, even of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of the land. Yea, the hand of the princes and the rulers hath been chief in this trespass. And when I heard this thing, I rent my garments and my mantle, and plucked off the hair of my head and of my beard, and sat down astonished. So what we have here is Ezra. He's been calling the people up. He's been trying to get things going back in Jerusalem, trying to get the temple back in operation. The people that were in Jerusalem, the poorest that were left there, and the few people that came back with Ezra, they've made this effort. But as this effort's taking place, as we see in verse 1, the people really just moved from Babylon to Jerusalem, but they want to maintain Babylon. They want to keep the status quo. They don't really want to leave, per se, Babylon. And that's a very difficult thing because Babylon has a far deeper meaning than an area, a place. It has to do with a way of life. It has to do with a mentality. It has to do with the way we see things. And so as we see in this passage, they're not wanting to leave. They're blending themselves in with the people of the land. They're following the traditions, as is said here, the abominations of the people of the land. There was a reason in the law of Moses why God told his people not to just marry into the rest of the nations. Because as we marry into the rest of the nations, we bring into our household customs and traditions that are not God's customs and traditions, and we need to be very careful. There was a way, if those that were from other nations wanted to join with the house of Israel, that they could. And there was even a way to get to the point of being able to marry outsiders. But typically speaking, we have the character as humans to be very hasty. We want to do things our way and not necessarily wait the plan that God has. And that's what we have in this story. They begin taking for themselves, it says, the daughters and the sons of the other countries around them. And so you have this mingling really that is very important, because the people that are coming in are not having the strength to cast out the idols. In other words, the women, the men that are coming from other nations and coming into the house of Israel are bringing their idols with them. Well, they can't hope for blessing from God as long as they maintain this idolatry. And that's part of the point of removing ourselves from Babylon, so that we can finally serve God as He would like us to serve Him. And so let's jump over to Leviticus for a moment and read a couple verses here. This is in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 24 through 30. And there's an image over to the side here that's important to think about, because and this has nothing to do with, per se, anything particular about the other nations, except that from God's point of view, they were not believers. And so you have all these apples in the bowl that have worms in them, rotten spots, idolatry, fornications, whatever it might be, other nations that, didn't follow the rules that God gave to His people. And you have this nice red apple, what God wants for His people. And so let's read verse 24 through 30. And these are difficult verses to think about, but they're so important for us even today as we see the world degenerating in its morality. It says, defile not yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you, and the land is defiled. Therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it. And the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants. And ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nations, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. And the land spew not you out also, when ye defile it, as it spewed out all the nations that were before you. Pardon me. For whosoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the soul that commits them shall be cut off from among their people. Therefore ye shall keep my ordinances, that ye commit not any one of these abominable customs which were committed before you, and that ye defile not yourselves therein. I am the Lord your God. And so what we see here is a very important point, that something was happening in these other nations. They were practicing something that before God was absolutely unacceptable. And this was one of the reasons that God did not want His people mixing with them. And so the idea was, if they come out of where they are and join themselves with the God's people and choose to follow God's rules, then there's a path to acceptance. But to bring them in as they are, with their traditions and their thoughts, is to begin to defile the people of God. Let's continue. We're going to jump backwards now. We actually read the lower verses in this passage. Now we're going to jump back up to the top of chapter 18, and we're going to read verses 6 through 14, because here is where God actually enumerates the problems that are existing out in the world. It says, none of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him, to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. The nakedness of thy father, or the nakedness of thy mother, shalt thou not uncover. She is thy mother. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover. It is thy father's nakedness. The nakedness of thy sister, the daughter of thy father, or daughter of thy mother, whether she be born at home or born abroad, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover. The nakedness of thy son's daughter, or of thy daughter's daughter, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover, for theirs is thine own nakedness. The nakedness of thy father's wife's daughter, begotten of thy father, she is thy sister. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's sister. She is thy father's near kinswoman. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy mother's sister, for she is thy mother's near kinswoman. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's brother. Thou shalt not approach to his wife, she is thine aunt. And so what we get in these verses that we're reading here is that there was a perversion, a sexual perversion that existed in the nations outside of Israel. And this sexual perversion was not acceptable by God. And in our day today, we can see that many of these sexual perversions have come back in mode. People are living however they want to, open marriages, no marriages, whatever it be. The rules that God set for his people are being torn down. And so we're living in a time just like this, where in general, society is saying, let's tear down the rules that God made because we want our own rules. We want to be free to do what we want to do. Let's continue in verse 15 through 23. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy daughter-in-law. She is thy son's wife. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter. Neither shalt thou take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. For they are her near kinswoman. It is, very important this word, wickedness. All of this to God was very incorrect. This isn't just, well, accidentally something happened. This isn't like I spilled coffee on the floor or something like that. To God, all of this sexual perversion is wickedness. This is not acceptable. Verse 18, neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister to vex her, to uncover her nakedness, beside the other in her lifetime. Also, thou shalt not approach unto a woman to uncover her nakedness, as long as she is put apart for her uncleanness. Moreover, thou shalt not lie carnally with thy neighbor's wife, to defile thyself with her. And thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire of Moloch. Neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God, for I am the Lord. Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is abomination. Neither shalt thou lie with any beast to defile thyself therewith. Neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down thereto. It is confusion. And so we have a whole long list of all the perversions that God despises. And, this comes into not just all of these acts with family, but it comes down to verse 21, thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Moloch. It was a custom in that time, really, to put this in very, very simple terms. This verse 21 is speaking of abortion. And it's hard for us to see that because of the words that are here. But the practice was, if a woman had a child, she could take it to the statue of Moloch. The statue of Moloch was a large metal statue. It had hands extended out front with the palms up, cupping, like as if you were going to cup water. They would put the baby in the cupped hands of the statue. Inside the abdomen or the base of this statue, there was a large hole where you would put in firewood, and you would start the firewood up. The whole statue would turn red hot, and of course the baby would be burnt to death. And this was the way in which they could destroy or get rid of offspring that you didn't want. And so you offered it to Moloch, a false god. And so God is saying, this is not acceptable. You cannot kill your children for pleasure. That's not acceptable. It also, in verse 22, it's kind of weird, the wording here, but specifically this is pointing to homosexuality. Mankind shall not lie with mankind, just as womankind will not lie with womankind. This is an abomination. God didn't say this is a recommendation. God didn't say that, I'd prefer it if you didn't do this. He's saying this is an abomination to him, homosexuality. And then in 23, we get into something even worse, because God knows that as we go down the path of sin, we advance. It starts with something simple like seeing, because in the first few verses that we read here, it was about uncovering, that is seeing. And then it advanced to lying down with, the sexual act. And then it advanced to, abortion, because obviously when we're doing something wrong, we've got to get rid of the evidence. And then it advances to homosexuality on both sides of the spectrum. And then it advances to the last step, which is bestiality, when we begin looking at animals and participating in that which is wrong. This is the path that God said that sin would take them, and that God's people were to be very careful not to bring this in. This isn't just a matter of, hey, my body, my rights, let me do what I want to do. This is because what we do as adults, especially what we allow our young people to do as teenagers and young adults, all of this is being watched by little children who are innocent. And so essentially, when we are doing these things, whatever the wickedness is, if it's something so simple as just looking at pornography, little innocent minds are watching what we're doing and seeing. We cannot hide it. It's impossible to hide it all. Those innocent eyes are seeing, and they're thinking, oh, this is okay, this is good. Their minds are beginning to be twisted and destroyed. We will be held accountable for this, and this is why these verses are important. This is why Ezra was so distraught when the people came to him and said, God's people aren't leaving sin. This is what we're talking about here. This was not being left behind. The people that they were bringing in without appropriate conversion were bringing in these defiled thoughts, and it was beginning to defile God's people. Let's continue in Ezra. We're in verse 4 and 5, chapter 9. Then were assembled unto me every one that trembled at the words of God of Israel, because of the transgression of those that had been carried away. And I sat astonished until the evening sacrifice. And at the evening sacrifice I rose up from my heaviness, and having rent my garment and my mantle, I fell upon my knees and spread out my hands unto the Lord my God. Ezra is totally distraught, and there's reason for this. If we think about the historically what happened, they were destroyed. The northern 10 tribes were destroyed by Assyria and other idolatrous nations first because of these sins. Then the southern 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, were destroyed by Babylon and taken captive. Why? For the same sins. God lets some of his people trickle back to Jerusalem to begin rebuilding, and what happens? They're still doing the same sin. What is Ezra expecting? He's expecting, metaphorically speaking, lightning from heaven to come down and strike them all. Because God not only saved them and preserved them, he sent them back to rebuild the temple, and here they are still doing the same sins. What could be expected? He understands that all that's to be expected is another nation's going to come in and trounce us and destroy us, just like what has happened so far. And so this is really important that they set aside their sins. Verse 6, and I said, O my God, I am ashamed and blushed to lift up my face to thee, my God, for our iniquities are increased over our head, and our trespasses are grown up to the heavens. And so he is totally demoralized, sad, broken, worried, because he knows that it was these sins in the first place that put him through all these troubles. Now, as we're looking at these people, these are the people who survived, maybe even the children or grandchildren of those that were taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't see the horrors. They didn't see necessarily the walls being torn down in Jerusalem. They didn't necessarily see all the people being killed and destroyed in Jerusalem, massacred by soldiers. They didn't see the bloodshed and the carnage. And so they don't understand the sadness of this. Ezra, understanding from the perspective of a minister, someone who has been called by God to do a task, he is thinking about all that has happened and saying, I don't want this to happen again. That was horrible. We do this is going to happen again. We have got to stop. But he also knows that the people have to be allowed to do what they want to do. This is free will agency. He can't become a dictator and begin to tell them this is what you have to do. Let's continue in verse 7 to 9. Since the days of our fathers have been in a great trespass unto this day, and for our iniquities have we, our kings and our priests, been delivered into the hands of the kings of the land, to the sword, to captivity, and to a spoil, and to confusion of face, as it is this day. And now, for a little space, grace hath been showed from the Lord our God, to leave us a remnant to escape, and to give us a nail in his holy place, that our God may lighten our eyes and give us a little reviving in our bondage. For we were bondmen, yet our God hath not forsaken us in our bondage, but hath extended mercy unto us in the sight of the kings of Persia, to give us a reviving, to set up the house of our God, and to repair the desolation thereof, and to give us a wall in Judah and in Jerusalem. So he understands. Ezra understands the consequences of these actions. He understands that if we continue to trespass, everything that happened will happen again. If we want to be free, we have to change our hearts. Verse 10 through 12. And now, our Lord God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken thy commandments, which thou hast commanded us by thy servant the prophet, saying, the land unto which ye go to possess it is an unclean land, with the filthiness of the people of the lands, with their abominations, which have filled it from one end to another with their uncleanness. Now therefore give not your daughters unto their sons, neither take their daughters unto your sons, nor seek their peace or their wealth forever, that ye may be strong, and eat the good of the land, and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever. And so the blessings from God come when we separate ourselves from the sins of the people of the land. It's not the people. It's not the other cultures. It's not the other races. It's what they do. So, if they change what they're doing and come in and accept God's rules, they're fully accepted without question. But if they continue operating under their own rules, then their sins come in and begin to mix with God's people, and everyone is now in danger. And this is what he's saying. We understand. You told us this was an unclean land, that the filthiness of the people, and when it uses filthiness, it's talking about exactly what we read in Leviticus. It's not talking about, other things that we might imagine. It's literally talking about the sexual perversions that were practiced. And that's why our sons and daughters were not to be allowed to marry with them, because we were supposed to raise up a righteous branch that set a good example. Verse 13 through 15. And after all that is come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great trespasses, seeing that thou, our God, hast punished us less than our iniquities deserve, and hast given us such deliverance as this, should we again break thy commandments and join in affinity with the people of these abominations? Wouldest not thou be angry with us till thou hast consumed us, so that there should be no remnant nor escaping? O Lord God of Israel, thou art righteous. For we remain yet escaped, as it is this day. Behold, we are before thee in our trespasses, for we cannot stand before thee because of this. And so he's recognizing himself as part of all the people. We deserve much worse. Obviously, if we as a people are continuing the very same sins that we were destroyed for, then the fact that God has shown us any mercy whatsoever is a mystery, because we deserve no more than the punishment that our forefathers received. And so that's what he's saying. God has punished us less than our iniquities deserve. We were a horrible people, and yet God has given us a breather. And so now what should we do? Should we continue in the sin? And, Paul says something like that, I believe, in the book of Romans, where he talks about, now that we are saved by grace, should we continue in sin? That's exactly what is playing out in this text. This is exactly the kind of thing Paul was referring to. And so, many people think that once they come to the church, accept Jesus Christ as their personal Savior, get baptized, whatever it is they feel they need to do, that suddenly all is well, and that's it. This passage is telling us from the Old Testament the same thing the New Testament tells us. He who repents, that's the ticket. It's not just coming in and becoming a part of God's people, it's changing our lives. That's the danger that Ezra is viewing for his people. The people are still living in danger. As he says in verse 15, we cannot stand before thee. We have no right, no permission even to stand before God because we are continuing the sins of our forefathers. And so this is important for us to think about and meditate on, especially in today when God is calling us once again as we look forward to Christ's second return, the setting up of his kingdom. We need to remember the only way we're getting in through the doors is to be God's people. And the example we have before us is just like we read here in Ezra. We have to leave behind the filthiness of the world. If we do not leave behind the filthiness of the world, then there's no way that we will be going into God's kingdom. We will be outside of the kingdom, just like all the other nations. And so it's important for us to look over our lives and make sure we are clean. Make sure that we are not violating the way and the thoughts of God. Even though everything we read there in Leviticus is in the Old Testament and in the law, I can tell you without any doubt whatsoever that stands today. If we are violating the sexual purity of God's people in any way, it's still a sin. And so we need to examine ourselves as a people, as individuals, and we need to come out of Babylon. We need to leave it behind because that's the only way that we can hope for salvation for God's people. Hope this helps you in some way in your life, and I pray that God will bless you today in all of your endeavors. God bless.